Is it now?
Hello, welcome to the Big Ben Show, and what a week in politics it has been. It's me, Alex Watson, today in the studio. Unfortunately, Lester's not here today, but he will be back next week. And I have two esteemed guests in the studio with me. Back to join us is Teena Lashmore, who was a Lib Dem PPC until obviously the election last week, and we'll hear all about her thoughts on what's happened, why it's happened, how she feels about the Lib Dems now. So much to talk about. And also with us on the show we've got Professor Gus John, who's a civil rights activist, an educational consultant and many other things, historian, and you can tell us a bit about that as well. So let's just get straight in there. And also, the phone lines are open if you do want to call in, especially once we've started to discuss stuff. It's 0208 808 0693, and I'll be repeating that number throughout the show. But welcome, Teena, welcome, Gus.
Hello.
I believe you two actually are acquainted, are you?
Yes, we are.
Oh, that's good. So no need for introductions between us. But so Teena, I'll start with you, because it was kind of, what's the word that happened to the Lib Dems? A decimation. Were you expecting it to be that bad?
As a first-time PPC, I was expecting it to be bad, but I didn't think it would be as bad. I actually felt that our leader back then, had done a very good job with the media explaining the benefits, or you could say the brakes, that the Lib Dems had put on to Conservative policy. But I don't think that resonated with people, and I don't think people quite understood that. And essentially, if, you know, as a junior party in a coalition, you're going to have one dominant lead, and that is the Conservatives. But had many of their policies gone ahead, I don't think we would be in the this period that we're in now, where we feel, well, it's not been too bad. But in actual fact, once they unleash a lot of their other policies, I think we will come to see how devastating their policies are for me, everyday people. So in terms of their policies will be beneficial for a few, and there's nothing against that. There is nothing wrong with recognising aspiration, an absolutely imperative part of our economy. But the recognition of aspiration does not have to be at the consequence of those on low incomes.
We spoke about this the last time, and you know, you kind of gave me a feel for why you joined the Lib Dems, because you've only been a Lib Dem for 2 years, and you haven't given up the badge or anything, you haven't handed it back?
I think it's a fantastic... no. I think what happens is I've been a community activist, like Gus, for many years, and that step over into a formal political party, you get some wins and you get some losses. The gains that you have as an individual is you lobby all political parties, and what it is that you want to get through, you will get some success in all of those parties to some degree, and at some point those parties will then come together and think it's their idea, and you get what you want. So so it's this sort of osmosis, if you like. But when you step into the formal political party process and you become a Liberal Democrat, the loss that you have is within your community, because people don't see you, they no longer see you as impartial.
Right.
But in actual fact, my passion for social justice and equality remains. However, that is now through the lens of a Liberal Democrat.
I think that's one thing I picked up from you the last time, because we had you and Yaha, I keep saying it wrong, on, and it gave me kind of more of a step back, because I suppose I'm quite a passionate person. A lot of times I probably think with my heart on my sleeve a lot, and you kind of give me a dispassionate view on the benefits, the pros and cons of joining a political party. But you're right, I suppose everything you do now will be seen through the lens of being a Liberal Democrat, as opposed to an impartial, activist, and that seems to sit okay with you, does it? I mean, you still seem to say a lot of things against, Lib Dem policies and what they stood for in terms of, the very first thing was joining up with the Conservatives. That was the first, I think, the major shocker. I didn't expect that. Did you at that time?
I think what it was interesting, because somebody asked me that the other day, and they said, you don't seem to talk about Lib Dem policies. in contrast to the coalition, I appeared not to be supporting Lib Dem policies, but that was in contrast because people saw the coalition and thought that was 100% Liberal Democrats. When we go back to our core policies and what it means to be a Liberal Democrat person and what those values mean, that's the value in terms of equality, equality of opportunity, equality of human rights. In that context, I am not talking against Liberal Democrat values. I'm actually very much a Liberal Democrat.
Okay, Gus, have you got any thoughts on that? Because I understand Teena's, perspective, but I'm trying to think of an analogy of what it's like to have all these values, but to kind of go totally against them in your actions. You know, that's what it seems like. That's what it from an impartial observer.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about it now because the coalition is over, so we can actually talk about it quite frankly.
Yeah. Gus, have you got any thoughts on what Teena said?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts actually. The first, I think, is that it is sobering to remember that in the 2010 election, lots of people who were disaffected from Labour voted Lib Dem because they considered Lib Dem to be left of Labour. So to move from that position, never mind the business of reneging on promises in relation to student fees, let's leave that aside for a minute. Yeah. To move from that position to one where you're in coalition with one of the most damnable conservative governments ever, it seems to me to be very, very weird indeed. And from my point of view, it would always be very difficult for the Liberal Democrats to claw back from the damage that propping up Cameron and his major party entailed, because it seems to me there is so much of what they did were the total antithesis of Lib Dem values and all the stuff that people had come to know and like the Liberal Democrats for. So whatever Nick Clegg may say about it was a good thing to do, the country was in a state, we helped to prop up the economy, etc., that's one way of looking at things. There would have been other ways of achieving the same ends rather than that austerity stuff, a lack of concern for the poor, the weak, the dispossessed, the demonizing of poor people, bedroom tax and all that kind of stuff. I mean, to be associated with all of that damaging stuff as a Liberal Democrat party was simply an anomaly, really.
Which I, as I said, that's why when people have said to me, you didn't appear to support the values, that's because as a Liberal Democrat, some of those values were not Lib Dem values. Right. That's why I appeared in some interviews to be a bit left of the coalition. And I was a bit left of the coalition because they weren't the values. And I just want to touch on Gus's point about the bedroom tax, for example. So because we were in a coalition and that got voted through, and it did get voted through with some Lib Dem people, but because there was a coalition, there was the opportunity to then go back to that policy and address it and change it and get mitigation in there. And that, I think, is a process of Lib Dems. And again, not many people are aware of it, but the ultimate outcome is there is still
we've got a phone call. Sorry to cut you there, Teena, but I think we've got a phone call and we can come back to your point. Is somebody on the line? Hello?
Hello?
Hello, who's speaking, please?
Delvin.
Delvin?
Yeah.
Hi, Delvin. What question would you like to ask them, the guests, or myself even?
It's on overstayers and what options does someone have that has stayed over 10 years overstayed?
Right.
Okay, sounds like
Do you know, he said, what options does, I don't know what that had to do with the discussion we just had, but I suppose in the light of what's happening now, what options does someone that's 10 years overstayed now have?
Well, I think it feeds into the big immigration debate, and Gus already mentioned about the demonisation of the disenfranchised, and that would include non-document migrants, for example, and as the caller is identifying himself as an overstayer. So me as a Liberal Democrat person, I was very much along the lines, well, if people have been managing it in a country for more than 10 years, they clearly have a support network. It's not fantastic, but they have a support network, and they've obviously developed relationships. Under the Human Rights Act, for me, which is very important as a Lib Dem, that has to be recognised. But in an arbitrary system, as the Conservative immigration policy is, for me, it's not recognised. It is, you have overstayed, you have gone against the British values by overstaying, and therefore you will be deported. I don't think it's as clear cut as that, but you know, I mean, what do you feel, Gus?
Selwyn, are you still there? No, he's gone, so you can still respond to the point there.
No, I agree wholly. I have, in the last couple of years, represented as an expert witness 3 families who were threatened with deportation on account of overstaying. In one case, somebody had also committed a criminal offense and had been imprisoned for it. The logic of all of that simply doesn't make sense to me at all, especially given the fact that in each case, apart from the fact that there were children who had special educational needs that couldn't be provided for in the country of origin, the profile of the individuals concerned, what they'd done here during the period that they had overstayed, and what their function was within the communities currently was such that you needed to have a much more nuanced approach to overstaying than simply saying we operate under the rule of law, you broke the law, so therefore we're going to kick you out.
Okay.
So again, I was going to say, in politics, that played out by having the immigration vans that were flying around, especially in this neighbourhood, and accusations were made about Lynn Featherstone being, you know, in position of leadership when that happened. Now, Lynn Featherstone is a Lib Dem, but she actually wasn't in that department when that happened. Okay. So you can see the battle.
Well, this is the problem that the Lib Dems have had, and I want to go onto your point about nuance, which is, you know, whatever they did, their point was never, you know, we never got to really understand, you know, why they did what they did, you know, how much they were mitigating against what were to be swinging cuts, which we will now see, and kind of how, you know, why they made the decision on to benefit, say, the country rather than maybe having a coalition with Labour. But I think we can actually now kiss goodbye to nuance. I think that's the feeling. And I just want to know both of your thoughts on what you felt, you know, on Friday morning when the results were coming in and you realised, you know, what had happened, and you could just imagine, you know, David Cameron's face and William Hague's little face. How did you feel?
I don't know about you, but were you at the count?
Well, no, I mean, I was sensible enough to go to sleep, frankly. It seems to me that any self-respecting person would have done that. No, I got up deeply depressed. Really? And I knew I had good reasons to be depressed. Because within hours, Cameron started to show his colours, and currently the government is actually using the fact that they have a majority to do stuff which I don't suppose many of the people who voted for them imagined. Now, they say, yes, it was in our manifesto, etc., etc. But frankly, the way they will now continue to erode the rights that people struggled for over many generations, to put Britain outside of the European realm as far as human rights is concerned, for example, is to me very frightening. Because what it appears to be doing is locking down Little Britain, putting some fence around it, and making people more and more insular and individualistic. So expect more racism, more xenophobia, more demonization of poor people, and a much more punitive approach to anyone who doesn't conform, whether it be in schools, young people on the streets, or whatever else it may be.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? It's that whole Little Britain. These are the people that we're fighting for, and these are. I'm not saying everybody who voted for them fits into that category, and like you said, they had their manifestos and maybe people voted for those manifestos, and I think they did have a lot of actual ethnic minority people that probably uphold some of their values. Some people that think that immigration is, there's too much immigration into the country. We had a couple of Conservative MPs on the phone last week and, saying things like, people don't have enough aspiration and, people need role models. And my point was there is a lot of role models, but, it's because you're not a certain type of person, you don't have a certain type of ethos about life or, very individualistic. And what I felt, I'm here to, what I felt was literally, do we have to kind of, not put the guns down, but kind of, do we have to go with this and be really hardcore ourselves and say, okay, it's time to kind of stop whinging and say, right, this is what we're dealing with. We have to become hardened ourselves, because it's almost, to me, Conservative policies have a lack of compassion deep there somewhere. And it's even worse to me than when Margaret Thatcher was in government, because a lot, you had more rights and more opportunities then, and it seems like those have been squeezed in a lot of ways. So I didn't get depressed because I didn't allow myself to. I didn't allow myself to go there. I was like, I'm not going to go there. But I do feel that we're going to see a lot of true colours.
I think for me, doing all the hustings that I did, and as a first-time PPC for the Lib Dems in Bethnal Green and Bow, going through those hustings and the questions that came out, and it's essentially what you're saying. Conservative policies are very economically driven, and the economic model that they use is a very sort of a capitalist model. It's absolutely void of social value.
Yeah.
And one of the things that epitomises that, for example, is in housing. And we've got this document in housing called a viability report. And this is what private developers use to justify why we can't have social housing in London. But this report is not available for anyone to read. So it's a report that you produce to justify why you can put up a development, a swanky development with no social housing, but no one is allowed to read the reports. And I'm absolutely committed, as I was before I was in the Lib Dems, I am committed to having that document made transparent.
Of course.
And I am committed to have in that document something called social value. Social value is where you and I come from. We engage on social value. Our relationships are not immediately built on an economic exchange. But in Conservative ideology, in my view, that's the issue, that their relationships, or they conceive their relationships to be immediately economic.
Yes, and I would add that helps to define the conception of the role of the state. So when you talk about rolling back the state and its involvement in our affairs, what they mean really is leave everything to the market, let it determine whether people eat or not, whether they have a roof over their heads or not. It's a philosophy of the survival of the fittest, frankly. So where communities don't really fit into that model, you sweep them aside, you displace all the institutions that they built and the spatial cohesion that they nurtured over many years. The gentrification of Brixton, for example.
Yes, yeah.
And you see it in all walks of life. Is the attitude towards commissioning in the health service and elsewhere, attitude towards the punishment of offenders, where there is very little concern for rehabilitation, and more private prisons being built, attitudes towards children in schools, and the high levels of exclusions we still have, particularly from academies.
Yes.
So it's all of a piece, and it's all part of that whole neoliberal ideology, which points in the direction of the individual and the market.
But we say it's survival of the fittest, but I mean, survival of the fittest on a level playing field might be something that I could endorse, but unfortunately, like you said, there's a lack of transparency, there's collusion, there's corruption, and so there is no level playing field from which people are supposed to elevate themselves from, And in terms of conservative values, I think, At their heart, I think, if you do well, you should you know,
Be
you should
rewarded.
benefit and be rewarded. But what I see is, I see an inequality. I see lots of inequality, and I see lots of corruption and lack of transparency around processes, like you said about this report. So why can't we see the report? For example, Chilcot, which we mentioned before. Why can't we see what happened with Chilcot? So to me, there's a lot of disinformation and lies that surrounds your so-called values. And so
can I just say, sorry, Gus, I just want to say, I believe, I honestly believe this, about 99% of people individually in politics are there because they are trying to do good. How they do that good is the issue. For me, the Liberal Dem values are better, and also the Green values are also very good as well in terms of how we do that. So how do we put our society together in a formation that is beneficial for society, so that it produces things, so that we can sell commodities and you know, engage in our our economy and our global economy, because that's essentially what government is about. And you're pointing out about how in conservative members of politics, and having spoken to one guy in one of my hustings, his name, I forget his name, but he explained that he had achieved everything he had because of he himself, and he was a Conservative member. And I said, and at what point have you paid the NHS back for your birth? Because I'm sure if you're born here, you're born in an NHS hospital. And I know that I can't cover the cost of my birth. So the fact that a Conservative person completely dismisses all the social benefits they have had and merely points to the fact that they have achieved something, that they achieved this in isolation of the entire society and community, let alone us as the consumers of that business, I just think it's wrong. I think it's fundamentally flawed thinking or distorted thinking.
It involves a heavy set of blinkers, doesn't it?
I mean, I just want to go back to something you said, Alex. There can never be a survival of the fittest on a level playing field, because the playing field is never level, particularly in this society. It is class-ridden. You have very, very wealthy people increasing in wealth as compared to the downturn that's causing austerity for so many and putting people into food banks and all that kind of stuff. People don't have equal choices, not in their education, not in the earnings, not in what the families leave to them. So we do not have a level playing field, which is why one must expect the state to perform the function of putting a safety net under those who are likely to drop to the bottom and die.
Okay, well, it doesn't seem like we're going to be having that safety net anytime soon. So what do you think some of the solutions are, or some of the way forward is for people like you, Teena, and people like you, Gus, who obviously have a big social conscience and believe society should be run on different, you know, parallel lines, but unfortunately, that's not the case. So what do we do about this? And for example, there was a story in the papers, I think yesterday, where Tesco had prosecuted a family that had, I think their children had already been living with the grandparents because they can't afford to feed them properly and stuff at the moment. Their benefits, I think, had been cut. But basically, this guy's gone into Tesco after hours to pick up some of the food that had been thrown away and was prosecuted. And I think he's been sent to prison. And this is the food that Tesco's was going to throw away. He didn't go into the shop and steal it from the shelves. So it's kind of, and then you contrast that with, you know, perhaps the Swiss banks and HSBCs of this world, and the fact that nobody or very few people have been prosecuted, the MP's expenses. And you do see, you know, very much one justice for one set of people and another set of justice for other sets of people. But it's all very doom and gloom, and it can be easy to feel despondent. How do we move forward from this point?
I think there are many lessons to be learned from this last election and that whole electoral process. I don't want to get into an argument right now about proportional representation and those kinds of tropes, but let me just say this. This government was elected to do all the wrecking that they will now proceed to do with about 26% of the votes. All right? Now, if that allows them to dismantle the Human Rights Act and all the other wretched things they're going to do in our name, all of us, especially the most vulnerable to human rights abuses, etc., then there clearly must be something very wrong with the system. All right. So for me, it isn't just a question, as Operation Black Vote has been saying for God knows how long, of getting more people to register to vote for the individual parties, black people I mean, or anybody. But it is a matter of people organizing themselves politically and independently of those parties in order that the manifesto should come from amongst the people rather than what those politicians think they could actually get away with. Because they do not represent the majority of the people. So for me, and particularly given the history of each single one of those governments ever since 1945, on the question of race, for one thing, it is a matter of how we organize ourselves into the kinds of formations at local level that is politically strong, democratically organized, that then enables us to make the kinds of demands that we want to make of those who are elected. If we then believe that by electing this particular group or that, we will have our demands met, then collectively we determine to do that. But frankly, this business of the two-party system or even the four-party system, God forbid that Nigel Farage and his lot should have any say in anything that black people might want to do. But that system is not working for the majority of us who will continue to be left behind even if all of the Europeans that they want to throw out were not in this country.
I hear you, Gus, and I'm probably more optimistic.
Good for you.
And that's because for me, essentially, what this campaign brought out to me, and this election brought out to me, is essentially what we're arguing about is money and space and quality. That's what we're arguing about, and how that is materialised.
Do you think it's just that, or do you think that there's a more malevolent kind of
No, I think there's rights in there as well. No, I think there are rights in there, but they're more fundamental, because when you're talking to people, and when you listen to some of the conversations that were picked up in UKIP, for example, there's too many migrants here. In other words, I've got to share my resources with more people. The assumption being, if there was less people here, I would be higher up the food chain. That's an assumption. That is not a reality. If there were less people here, the reality is you would be lower down the food chain because there would be less people under you. And that's very difficult to people to process. And why is that? And for me, one of the tools that supports that fundamentally is our monetary system, our monetary policy. And if you note, during these elections, not one political party brought up monetary policy and monetary review. And that's because they have to acknowledge that in our country, in England, this is unique to England, our economic decisions are being dominated by the 6 banks. If our economy is being dominated only by 6 banks, then do you really honestly think that a political party is making those decisions?
Well, this has been the argument, isn't it? That it's actually big business that runs things.
But it's actually in particular, because we can say big business, and that's too broad because you can't challenge that. So one of the things that I talked about in my hustings, for example, and I'm very committed to, and I belong to an organisation called Positive Money. I'm part of a reading group, and this is to bring this level of knowledge into the community so people understand it. If it's our banks that create our economy through making debts and loans, and there's only 6 of them, and that's the reason why we have an expanding economy or a shrinking economy. Nothing to do with what we're producing, but to do with what is in circulation. And we see this most succinctly in London, because those 6 banks have been throwing money at the housing market in London. And as a consequence, so they're producing 97% of the economy. And of that 97%, 40% of that money that they've created is thrown at the housing market. So for you and
the housing market in forms of mortgages,
in forms of also all those little sort of nuances about how you can get your house, you know, from shared ownership. All of those financial tools are being underpinned by this, but also holding on to land as well. So if the economy, which is 97% created by the banks, is throwing 40% of that money at housing and only 10% at business, what do you think is fueling our economy?
And that is why so many poor people are being displaced from London. And you're likely to have a little bubble in the country called London, where it's only if you're very rich you could afford to live in the place, or to have businesses that are thriving. So small businesses, young entrepreneurs, etc., must either aim to operate at a level that's consistent with this model, or there's no room for them. And my point is this: you cannot talk about living in a liberal democracy if you do not have policies that acknowledge that there is an uneven distribution of wealth, an uneven distribution of choices that you make in life about your life and your future, and that therefore the state has got a function in protecting the weak and vulnerable and ensuring equal opportunities for all. Now, that is not what we see, whether not from the Labour Party or from the Conservative Party in what they do in government.
So what about other parts of the country outside of London? How does this banking, I mean, we probably should go for a break soon, but how does this banking system, because if you're saying only 20% of our productivity actually comes from business, and are you talking about business as a whole, which includes big business?
So there's big business and there's small business.
Yeah.
And most people recognise the engine of our economy is driven by small business. So you get big corporates, but they are, as a business, big corporates are able to modernise, they can bring technology in very quickly. So very quickly, they can dispense with employing people. So big businesses become very efficient very quickly. Small businesses become efficient slowly, but in the process, they give us work. And they give us work for longer. We have a longer relationship with them. So that's why we refer to small businesses as the engine of the economy. That's not to say we can't have big businesses. Of course we can't, but we need to see them as more short term, which most capitalism and analysis of capitalism does see that. And small businesses long term. This government, the coalition, just to draw this to a close, the coalition saw that, which is why we had to go cap in hand as a coalition under something called the Merlin and beg the 6 banks to please give money to small businesses to stop the recession. Now, you may have picked that up in the newspaper, but again, when we talk about it in such a way that I think, oh my gosh, I have no idea what you're on about. But actually, because I'm in politics, I can kind of deconstruct it a little bit. So the Merlin was a begging bowl to the 6 banks. Please, can you give, in your money creation, can you give to small businesses so that they can invest and expand and employ more people so we do not have this economic crash? And although the 6 banks agreed to do that, I'm not quite sure how long it was before they reneged on that promise. But we didn't see that renege on that promise we didn't see that flashed on our newspapers because the 6 banks are involved in our media, as has already been pointing out through these elections. So it's not that it's a conspiracy, but what we've got to do is we have to come together as people and we have to tack the tools that are going to make a fundamental difference. And the tool that makes a fundamental difference is our monetary policy. If we can only have 6 people running our economy, to me, that's called a monopoly. You call it a small monopoly, but it's a monopoly. And if you recall, just before I finish, Ed Miliband talking about the monopolisation of our fuel, of our electricity and our gas, and how he's going to break that down. But that was great. That was on the utilities. But you know, no one will do it on the banking. And that's what we've got to push through.
Why do you think no one will do it through the banking? Why do you think that politicians are afraid to stand up to?
I think we've got too much invested in it. You and I are invested in it. I mean, I've got my lunch to go and buy, and that's an investment in the bank, and so do you. But what I say to people is, if you are furious, what you do is you start using cash. When you look at those adverts promoting our debit card, that's called private banks money. Cash belongs to our Bank of England. That we have some control over, but that only represents 3% of our economy. So when you and I are using our cash, that is representing 3% of our economy. When we use the cards to pay for stuff, that is essentially the 6 banks, which I call the 6 private banks, and that is their money. So who do you think is profiting? When you go down to a small business and maybe you want to buy, you know, a local business is making some bowls, breakfast bowls, and you want to support that local business, I say pay cash. Because what happens from cash is I have to go to the cash machine and draw out cash, which means that private bank has to buy that cash from the Bank of England. You start to break down that monopoly. But that is just on one level. Fundamentally, it needs a monetary policy review, and we, as part of Positive Money, are calling for a commission. So that the economy is driven by a commission.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think we'll just leave it there for a while. We'll come back to these subjects after the break. If you do want to call in, it's 0208 808 0693, and we'll carry on talking about the post-election kind of desecration and maybe a bit about Labour and what it means for them and other stuff. That was great. Thank you. So we'll go for a break now.
Because he knows it's...
Hi, and thank you. We're back from our break. This is the Big Ben Show, and in the studio I have the wonderful Teena Lashmore, who's been breaking down the election desecration for us, alongside Professor Gus John, who's also been contributing. So guys, yeah, you were just speaking about before the break about the monetary policy and, you know, the need for reform, and I don't think we've really talked about how we might achieve that, but we'll come back to that. But let's have a little bit of a look at the Labour situation now. We've spoken a lot about the Lib Dems that have all but disappeared from the political landscape in any kind of meaningful way at the present time. But what do you think holds the future for Labour at this particular moment? There's a leadership thing going on. Ed Miliband stepped down. So Gus, I'll come to you first. How do you feel about Labour in itself? How do you think about its performance in this election? And why do you think they, failed to? Obviously, there's this SNP situation, but why do you think they failed to kind of get the public behind them to change things in the country?
Well, in my book, Labour has lost its way. I don't think it knows any longer who it is or what it is for. And that is reflected very much in the way they ran the opposition to the coalition government. I find much of what they stand for totally contradictory in the following sense. Blair built on Thatcher, all right? And the Blair agenda was very much a continuation of the Thatcherite agenda in a number of respects. I'm an educationalist, as you know.
Yes.
And frankly, what has happened with schooling and higher education in this country under Labour has been disastrous.
How have you seen those changes affect grassroots education, or have they panned out on the ground?
Well, in many respects, the academies program, which the Labour Party started and are still very passionate about, and which is having a devastating impact upon how schooling is organized, how schooling provision is made at local level, the power that parents have to influence schools, and particularly the experience of black children within the system. That's one example. You cannot commodify schooling and still make it compulsory for people to send their children to school. If I have to, by law, send my children to a school, and all you tell me that school must be this academy down the road, over which my local government, my locally elected politicians have no control, and the only recourse I have in terms of what happens when they foul up is to the Secretary of State or some kind of an ombudsman or whatever that the Secretary of State appoints, then I say that there's nothing democratic about that. I cannot choose not to send my child to a school run by some carpet magnate or somebody who puts pipes in the ground as an industrialist. So therefore, all the stuff that Labour espouses about its values run contrary to what it actually does in respect of those matters. I'll say the same about its penal policies and the number of people who are imprisoned, the fact that it does nothing whatsoever about the burgeoning number of black people in the prison system.
And Muslims now. The
Precisely. And then, of course, the whole business about prevent and extremism, which is a mess. Conceptually, it doesn't make sense. Nothing is actually defined, and yet you're putting requirements upon people to demonstrate that they are countering this, that, or the next thing, which effectively gives people the right to abuse people's human rights.
Right, so all the points you're making, and all the points you've both made, seem to me to be, really salient points. So do you think this is ideology driven? Because why would you put a school system in place that does not educate children to their best welfare, and which means that parents have no say? So like you said, you said you've seen it affect especially black and ethnic minority children, but other children as well.
Sure.
So in what ways has it affected them? What's actually happening? What's happening to these young children?
Well, look, my point is this, that you are superimposing a private or pseudo-private commodified system onto a local, what ought to be a government service, and removing the controls and the rights that parents have, the safeguards that parents have, from those who were in a position to guarantee those safeguards. You can't have it both ways, and worse than that, the government itself is not scrutinizing what these people do. As a matter of fact, they put in place, they remove the safeguards, so that, for example, in relation to school exclusions, head teachers abuse their powers as far as excluding children are concerned. They do not follow the government's own guidelines. When parents attempt to protest about that, they then find that the hands are tied, because the whole system, the review system, the panels are constituted in a way that displaces parents' rights to appeal.
So is it not just the fact that, these children are unruly and that they need to be,
I think it's easier than that. I'm sorry, guys, I'm going to bring this down. I think it's easier than that. What's happened under the recent years, for the last 20 years, I put it into that framework, is essentially our schooling has been fragmented into, we got Daily Mail driven value schooling, we've got Metro driven value schooling, we've got independent driven value schooling, and depending on where you live, depends on where your child will go to school. So if you've got a child who's more flavoured towards independent newspaper, and you want a school that's driven by the independent newspaper, but you live over here where it's only the Daily Mail, then you have a problem, because the kind of quality of education that's going to be complementary to your child is available over here, and you live here.
And that hence the housing kind of...
So you become, and you did use the word commodify, which I agree, and because what's happening in schooling is commodification, is this efficiency drive. Now, if I can have 10 school children silent and doing parrot teaching, i.e. repeating back to me what I have said, that is cost effective above creativity, where I allow 10 children to deconstruct the newspaper however that is, whether it's ripping it up or whether it's underlining text and keeping it, that is more costly in time and resources. Now, every child goes through those learning phases. We all have gone through them. But the issue is we get trapped under the current system. If I'm more flavoured towards the creative side, but my school is being paid for by Daily Mail, then I have to conform to Daily Mail ideology. But my development may actually be independent.
Hasn't that always been the case, though, even under the comprehensive and grammar systems where, you know, and then you had arts colleges, so where some children would fall through the cracks because they, you know, do you think we've ever got an education right?
I think it's not. I don't think it's impossible, but
it was better.
We have to recognise that. First of all, for me, we have to recognise that the push of efficiency and commodification has an impact. And if we are going to be battery farming our children into school, into college, into university, and then battery farming them into the workplace, well, we know the outcome of that. It's less efficient.
And the fact of the matter is that children are not some kind of a homogeneous group, which is why you give children their entitlement by attending to their individual needs. It is difficult to do that within a kind of mass-produced schooling system, we know. But at the same time, unless you can connect with the individual and their needs and the patterns of learning, you're simply trying to enforce a conformity for some people for whom it simply does not work. And that is one of the reasons why there are so many exclusions. That's one of the reasons why the idea of the canned exam system is the complete antithesis of what education should be about. Precisely.
Essentially, and as a Lib Dem, one of the policies that we pushed was that we seem to be paralysed by the bigger picture, and as a consequence, what we came up with, one of the tools we came up with, well, if we could feed the children, then they can at least have a chance of engaging.
I appreciate what you're saying, and I want to come back because we don't have that much time to back onto Labour. What I do feel about the Lib Dems is that for all the policies that they had, they would have been better off the last time going for a Labour coalition to have some of these things go through, and perhaps they were banking on this kind of being the swing party again, but the voters totally rejected that. The voters totally rejected that idea. They said we're cutting you out of this picture. For whatever their reasons were. So it's great to talk about the liberal values and the policies that they had, but I think the fundamental thing is because of what they did the last time, they've made their position null and void in the context of our modern politics or our politics of today, and unfortunately. So I just want to go on to talk about Labour. Just before we end it, I mean, we've spoken about it a little bit, and perhaps the leadership. What do you think about this leadership? We've got Chuka Amuna saying that he will stand. Perhaps David Lammy. We've got I forgot her name.
Harriet.
Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott has just said that she might run for the London mayor elections. We've got Boris Johnson being given a seat in the kind of faux cabinet as well as being London mayor. It's all kind of gone. It's all changing. What do you think about the leadership election, and what do you think the chances are? You know, what do Labour have to do over this next 5 years? Because I don't know what really the Lib Dems can actually do at this point. Alongside the SNP, what can be done?
I see all of those people emerging: Burnham and Omuna and Yvette Cooper and so on and so forth. And one expects that. But frankly, it is all totally immaterial if the Labour Party as a party, as a political organization, does not define what it is, what its purpose is, and what its purpose is, particularly in relation to the onslaught that is coming from this Conservative government. And in a sense, that is more important than whatever any one of those contenders might want to say about themselves and their leadership qualities. Because it is fundamentally what
a lack of clarity about who they are.
precisely, and what labor is about in this dispensation, where you don't have unions and the masses of people organized around trade unions anymore. You have an industrial base that's been pretty decimated. A much more individualistic approach to the organization of social systems and communities and so on.
I think we're going to wrap up soon. I think David Miliband and I think Alistair Campbell and those kind of sorts that don't seem very Labour to me, but have come out saying that, and Chukwuemeka have come out saying that the reason why Labour lost the election is because they, perhaps not just because they weren't definitive enough, but their policies were not far enough to the right, and that Labour needs to now take a step to the right. That's kind of, and I don't know if it's just because our media is owned by, right-wing kind of, backers, but this is the mood that's coming out, that Labour, and I don't actually agree with it, because otherwise you wouldn't have got maybe perhaps all those SNP votes and UKIP, and there's so much more that we could have talked about today, but I'm going to just give you each one of you a final word. It doesn't have to be about Labour, it can be about anything, your defining thoughts on this election. I'll start with you guys. Have you got any last final things to add to wrap this up?
I think given the direction in which this government is going, there is a need for more people in communities across different ethnic lines to organize and continue, in fact, step up the struggles that we've been having over the last decades in terms of defending people's fundamental rights and ensuring we have a society that is not divided along class and capitalist lines, but one where our children can look towards some opportunity in future and a life that is less compromised by where you're born or the kind of job that your parents have.
Okay, thank you for that, Gus. And Teena, one final word?
For me, final word is going to be, I think the Labour leadership and the fact that we've got black and minority ethnic members standing, I think that's going to give tremendous hope and aspiration to the next generation. And I think that is beneficial. I don't think it's going to be reflected in the Liberal Democrats' leadership election, simply because the numbers aren't there, but it is in the Labour, and I think we need to get together behind that and see that as a benefit in itself.
Okay, so there you have it, guys. Thank you for joining us this week. That was Teena, Lashmore, and that was Professor Gus John giving us their perspective on the election that was. And thank you very much for joining us this week. We'll have Leicester back next week, where we'll have Delroy Washington from the Foundation of Reggae Music in the UK, and we'll also have Chantal Moore, who runs a company called Shanti Media, and looking forward to having them on. So have a great week. Don't get too despondent. There is always hope. And thank you for joining us on the Big Ben Show this week.